the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion and our guest, we just want to mention briefly we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. Taylor has been kind to lead a reading group on his recent translation of Axel Chernyavsky's, what is it, Deleuze's Method. I butchered the title.
That was the French title. The French title was like Concept and Method, which makes it sound really fancy. But the Edinburgh, I love them, but they want to have Deleuze's name in the title, not the subtitle. So it's Deleuze, Philosophy and the Creation of Concepts. That's the English title.
I forgot to put that in my little spiel here. I'll have to adjust that, but it seems to be going well and people are enjoying that. But moving on, we're really happy to be joined by Emily Herring this morning, a scholar whose work brings together a lot of intellectual history, philosophy, and cultural events of the 20th century. She's recently published Herald of a Restless World, How Henri Bergson Brought Philosophy to the People. That was published in October, so that's out. We'll be sure to link to that book so you guys can take a look and purchase if you'd like. So she's looking at the life and thought of one of the most overlooked philosophers of the modern era, known for his radical thinking of time, consciousness, human experience, and his influence on artists, intellectuals, and political figures of the 20th century. But Emily, thank you so much for joining us. And we like to start off these episodes by asking for our guests. We sort of like to refer to it as a philosophical origin story. And I know you do sort of hint at this in the book a little bit in the introduction, but we just would like to give you the opportunity to discuss if there's something that stands out in your life, whether that would be perhaps a class you took or a family member that was interested in philosophy, an encounter with a thinker, an encounter with an artist, etc. You can really take that and run with that in any direction you'd like. And then if you further would like to extend that to Bergson specifically, and perhaps even the inspiration for writing this book, please feel free. And if you need me to repeat any of that at a later time, just let me know.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. So I am half British and half French. So I grew up in France and I did most of my school there. And in France, everyone studies philosophy in high school. And I actually had quite a lot of hours of philosophy per week, and I really loved it. And that was the first time I encountered Bergson in those early philosophy classes where I was getting very excited about philosophy and this general feeling that you get if you get into philosophy. I think that the excitement you can feel as a young person is, suddenly I certainly got the feeling that sort of a veil was being lifted from my eyes, and I was learning how to sort of look at the world in completely different ways and examine language in different ways. So that was all very exciting to me. And in the book, I mention that the first time I encountered Bergson was about his ideas about language, and how, sometimes language can be a little bit too rigid, and words can be labels instead of sort of translating the often complex and diverse realities that they're denoting. And you talk about sort of, in your question at the start, you talked about a class maybe that really, participated in my philosophy origin story. So after high school, I went on to study philosophy. And I just remember one of my first ever lectures was by a French academic called Xavier Guchet, and it was a philosophy of technology lecture. And I just remember him starting by saying, so in French, it was like, vous ne servez à rien. So you are basically useless. You study philosophy, so you are useless. And I am here to teach you how to be useless. And he meant that in a really positive way, in the sense of like, we're in this consumerist capitalist society.
Gotcha.
And yet there is value in being useless in that environment. And I think that really spoke to me. But then I got back into Bergson and got kind of obsessed. And that led me to do a PhD. And I was actually also really interested in the history of science. So my PhD was on Bergson's reception among biologists, the biologists of his time. And it turns out there were quite a few sort of early 20th century biologists who were really into creative evolution for various reasons. And the reason I then wanted to write this book was because during my time as a PhD student in the UK, I just was either met with people who'd never heard of Bergson, or people who'd heard from him through the lens of either Bertrand Russell, so a very sort of distorted portrait of him, or there's a Monty Python sketch that mentions Bergson. So it kind of seemed wild to me that he was so forgotten when he had been so famous and so influential in the Anglophone world as well. So I think that was a big motivation behind writing this book for an Anglophone general audience.
And that's the sketch you mentioned in the epilogue, right?
Yeah.
Okay. It's
the whole joke revolves around Bergson's name being so obscure. That's kind of the whole punchline of the joke. Of the sketch. Yet
in the general ether that she can just pull it out, right?
Yeah.
The contestant can just pull it out of the air. So it's there, but it's obscured, right?
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
kind of the that's see, it's interesting because the whenever you say Monty Python and philosophy, I think of their song or the soccer match, right? Like so that's that's great. And I do see that some of your research about the influence of on the biologist you get to put a little bit of that in, right? We hear about I know Huxley is one that might be familiar, not Aldous but Julian, right? Yes. But I don't remember the other names off the top of my head, so you'll have to.
There was another Russell, actually, confusingly. There was an Edward Stuart Russell, who's a biologist.
Gotcha.
And others, yeah.
And I know, Coop, you started off with wanting to talk about creative evolution because that was one of your favorite. I know you said that two of our favorite episodes we've done together. We've probably done close to 200 now, right? Wow. Was on Bergson. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know that you mentioned that you loved creative evolution was one of Bergson's works that really drew you in, and I absolutely feel the same. I mean, obviously, then we read Bergsonism by Deleuze as well, which also really was enjoyable. I mean, I don't have a lot to say beyond that because it's been so long. Honestly, I can't remember what we've read. But I
guess two things stand out from Bergsonism and then from creative evolution. One, and we can tackle these in any ways. And I do want to get to some more of the biographical as well, so we can weave in and out of which is what you do in your book. You kind of have three terrains, which I guess we should start with because I'm trying to remember. You have obviously the biographical, more about the man, but you also weave in a kind of a story, a history of the ideas, right? Yeah. And then would the third be more of the sort of political or cultural events going on? I fill me in on how you lay out the three. Is that okay?
The way I was in the introduction of the book, I was trying to do a little caveat, really, which was to say that, when you write a biography, or when you're reading a biography, you perhaps expect this, huge tome, 800-page tome of that covers every single detail, and that obviously wasn't going to happen in a book about Bergson. My publisher wouldn't have let me do that because I'm introducing this obscure figure, and so I had to be very selective in what I was doing, and I like to think about it as a portrait rather than this exhaustive way of looking at him. So a portrait of the man, of his philosophy, and of the time, the environment in which the ideas and the man sort of came about. And a portrait obviously is going to always be relative to the portrait. It's always going to have that subjective, idiosyncratic element to it, where I'm drawn to him. Certain aspects of his life, certain aspects of his philosophy are going to draw me in more, and that's what I focused on. But I do cover obviously his whole life, but I had to be selective. So that was the idea behind it.
I mean, I mentioned to you Bergson's idea that a portrait is always a self-portrait in a way, and so and you acknowledge that you are. I mean, and it's maybe it's been said more these days, but I guess it's easy to believe that there is some sort of omnipresent third-person narrator that's absolutely disinterested in the material. But as Coop already mentioned, one of the things you are interested in is perhaps, or as you mentioned, right, since you were trying to bring this to an Anglophone world, that one of the distorters of Bergson, who still may be remembered, is Bertrand Russell, right? So your own interest in, maybe not, I don't want to say defending Bergson against Russell, but at least painting your own portrait of Russell's interests, which I found very fascinating and a little salacious, kind of. I didn't know that about him too. We got a couple of moments about his, let's say, dalliances or womanizing, whatever you want to call it. But before we get to that, because I want to give you time for that, I did want to say too that, am I correct? I believe, I can't remember if you said this yourself or if I read this in a blurb. Is this the first biography of Bergson published in English first?
Yeah, that's right. So there has been in French about 25 years ago now, in 2000, I think there was a biography that came out.
Jankelevich, right? Or
no, so by two Bergson scholars. So by a scholar called Philippe Soulez, and who actually died while he was writing the book, and so then it was taken up by Frédéric Worms, who is still kind of the big Bergson guy in France still. And it's an extremely, I mean, for me, it was an incredible resource, but it's an extremely sort of scholarly, erudite book.
It's a different type of biography.
Very different, yeah. And it's and it's written for people who already know about Bergson in mind.
Gotcha.
It's a different task that they undertook, but they had access to, because it was written a quarter of a century ago, they were able to talk to people, very, very, very old people who sort of knew him, or who knew him when he was very old, kind of thing. So they had that kind of direct link to his life, which obviously for me was really helpful.
No, I think that you're right. There's a different audience you're trying to reach, and that's why you're able to weave in those three, because there's a new generation of thinkers who probably come to Bergson by serendipity and may not know much about the man. And I do think that the first 100 pages was really drew me in, because there's all this detail about the young Bergson and his life, his schooling, and you even get to dramatize some of these moments, bringing in again someone who maybe, I mean, for example, my friend who is deeply into Marxist scholarship and whatnot didn't know much about Jaurès and that encounter, right? You kind of dynamize these two figures who seemingly couldn't be different, right? And the Bergson, the sort of lonely metaphysical thinker, the sort of firebrand socialist, like those kind of moments leading up to the adult popular Bergson. I found that really hooked me into the narrative.
Great. Well, that's good to hear. That's what I wanted. and I mean, I know we're going to come back to it, but you mentioned Russell. I think a lot of my job writing this book, as you said, it's not quite defending Bergson, but it kind of is undoing some of the damage that kind of was done by Russell, where he paints this very unfair portrait of Bergson that I think requires serious work to be undone, because it kind of has stuck. All these caricatures of Bergson as this unserious, unrigorous, anti-rationalist, which none of these are true. And so I had to be very aware of who I was writing this for, which is why the notion of the portrait, the notion of the way and I'm glad you picked up on the Jaurès story. Also, just side note, so I speak English, and then sometimes I pronounce the names in a French way, sometimes I pronounce them in a British way. So you'll hear me say Bergson, and then you'll hear me say Bergson, and just don't worry about it. It's just I can't help it.
We're both from the South. I'm in Texas and he's in Atlanta, so you'll also have to bear with us as well.
But so I think that's okay.
I make no qualms about the fact that we sometimes do a disservice to the French pronunciation.
That's fine.
You might hear someone in Texas pronounce it Henri Bergson. Henri Bergson.
I love that.
I do think that it is, just because you brought up language earlier, and I know, again, maybe it's okay. I left aside my thought about the other two episodes, Coop, and I'll try to get back to them. But it does make sense that someone like Bertrand Russell helping to start what is popularly known as analytic philosophy, which still has a stranglehold, I'll say, maybe not as tight of a grip, but it still has a grip on the, let's say, academic version of philosophy as a discipline in the United States, in the UK, who is going to be pushing for philosophy to mainly focus on a kind of logical analysis, as though problems could be dissolved by sort of focusing on meaning. For Bergson, we're already not even in the same universe to a certain extent, right? Bergson's notion of intuition, for example, which we could talk about either here or later, would already, I think, be anathema, or already call into question that kind of exclusive logical analysis, where if we're just clear with the words we use, we can get to the heart of the thing. And I think Bergson says you'll never do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually find it really interesting to think about sort of these early 20th century anxieties about language. And as you said, so there are two directions that you can go in, or obviously more directions, but there are two clear directions, different directions, where someone like Russell is thinking, well, our language is not precise enough to describe the realities that the physicists are trying to describe, and therefore we need higher levels of abstraction, and we need to be as precise as possible. And Bergson is also anxious about precision, but he means it in a completely different way, because for him, the more abstract we get, the further away from the reality we are aiming to describe we get. And this all ties in with actually his ideas about the stuff he gets to later, actually, in Creative Evolution. I say later relative to what he was doing in just before Creative Evolution, coming up with the idea of, or his method of intuition, and really putting that on the page in 1903 in Introduction to Metaphysics. And so his idea about the limitations of language, there's this idea that we use concepts, we have to use concepts and words to sort of tidy up the kind of overwhelming diversity of reality. But in doing so, we lose sight of what is special, particular about the different aspects of reality that our words describe, including our inner lives. And often the words we use will trick us almost into thinking of our inner lives as these sort of inert moments that we can sort of move around, and we then sort of miss the flux and the flow of it. And there's this idea that he has that sort of words and symbols and concepts they're practical and unavoidable ways of making sense of the uninterrupted flux of the multiple interpenetrating qualitative states of reality. Because how else would we classify? How else would we quantify? How else would we even communicate? But we are missing something when we're doing that. And that's where intuition comes in. And that's where metaphysics come in, because he has this weird turn of phrase in Introduction to Metaphysics where he says, metaphysics is the science that claims to dispense with symbols, which sounds very difficult to imagine what that would be like. And he's not saying that we need to do away with language, but he's saying that we should think of language in different ways. And that conceptual language, very useful for scientists, more tricky when it comes to philosophy, which obviously someone like Bertrand Russell is not going to be on board with something like that, right? But to be slightly more concrete, so most of the time we don't experience the kind of qualitative multiplicity, the continuous flow of our inner life, because we're caught up in social and practical requirements. So if you say I'm hungry, or if you say I'm angry, or if you say I love you very much, whatever meaning is behind those words, that this was the whole, words are mere labels we affix to things. We treat these internal states as discrete objects with well-defined boundaries. We're removing them from the organism that is our internal life, or the organization that is our internal life. And so Bergson proposes, and this is why his language, the language he uses, is so full of images. It's because, but he does this it's not because he's a poet, even though he was often called a poet.
Yes.
He's doing this as a philosophical method. He believes that using images and metaphors rather than static concepts will, if he uses enough of those metaphors that are all kind of pointing in the same direction, will help put his reader on the right track of the intuition that he's trying to express, but that escapes language. So it's all, all very tricky, especially if you are convinced that conceptual, logical language is the only way to express reality. So there's this sense that, and Bergson actually uses he distinguishes between what he calls analysis and intuition as two different forms, the two different ways of looking at reality and apprehending and knowing, trying to know reality. So analysis is you're outside of the object that you're studying, and you are taking as many points of view on it as you can. And this can go on to infinity. There's infinite points of views that you can take, and you'll never exhaust your subject matter. And so he gives lots of images.
You use one yourself, the story of Achilles and the tortoise is a version of this somewhat.
Exactly. So the idea that if you look at someone's trajectory, if you do an arm movement, you can trace that line, the line that the arm has followed, and then you can cut up that line geometrically. You nothing stops you from cutting that into as many points as you want and dividing it into any ways as you want. And you can add layers upon layers of complexity to describe each intricate aspect of the movement. You can push the boundaries of abstraction as far as you want, of analysis as far as you want. But from this analysis of the movement, you will never arrive at the movement itself. That's kind of the idea, is that intuition is what it would be to coincide with the reality you're trying to describe. So by analogy, it's also the difference between a novelist, pages and pages of description of a character, reading those pages, the difference between that and then being that character for even a split second, the knowledge that you would have of what it is like to be that character, and then the analysis of the character. And so the idea of intuition is, it's this kind of, he calls it an effort. So this kind of, it's doing away with all these layers of spatialized, conceptualized, all these ways in which we are abstracted from reality, in a sense. I don't know if that's a good way of putting it. And sort of almost attaining a sort of pre or sub conceptual state, and being able to study reality following its own contours, following its own movement, which obviously is an extremely difficult thing to do, and it's only fleeting. It's only it's not like there is this meditative state where he's like, oh, I am one with the élan vital now. But it's an effort. It's an effort to undo all the layers of conceptual knowledge that we need in, it's a practical need that we have. And the philosopher, the metaphysician, is someone who has no practical requirements. There's no, there's no measurement, there's no technology that's going to come out of this. What the metaphysician is doing away with all practical requirements, doing away with all the ways in which we freeze reality into concepts, and trying to catch a glimpse of that movement of life, of consciousness. So again, you can see why that would sound insane to someone like Russell, or why that still sounds insane to people raised on Russell. But I guess a point I would like to make is that, and even Bergson said this several times, that he wishes he hadn't used the word intuition.
Yes.
Because it's so heavily historically charged. There's so much. It's not a passively received vision. It's not. It's not a hunch. It's not a vibe. It is an effort to undo some of the sort of most profoundly ingrained habits of thought. So it's something quite powerful and quite deep, I think. But obviously, it's so easy to just reduce it to this almost woo-woo type.
Mysticism is the one that is another label that he gets thrown at.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So so this might actually help us segue into creative evolution, maybe, if you wanted. Sure. Because studying sort of when I was studying creative evolution really seriously for my PhD, it kind of occurred to me that the reason he starts studying, or the reason he's interested in the history of life, is because he starts becoming interested in the origins of our intellect as humans. And he sort of gets to this idea that in order to be able to understand life, we have to understand we have to have a good theory of life. You have to have a good theory of knowledge, because knowledge itself is a product of the evolution of life, or our intellect itself is a product of the evolution of life. And so he comes to this idea that our intellect and all the concepts that it has produced it's itself the product of a history, an evolutionary history, by which we as humans were confronted with, inert matter and the obstacles of our environment. And so we are, almost by symbiosis with the environment, our intellect adopted the contours of inert matter, as did our concepts, as a practical means of being able to deal with it and build from it. And this is, again, great for all sorts of practical reasons, but not so great for actually understanding anything that isn't inert, like life. And so there's this paradox, or this paradoxical state, where our intelligence has evolved in such a way that it is bad at understanding evolution.
I always loved it. I love that way of putting it. Yeah.
I think it's interesting. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, I was going to say I can go on for hours, so please stop me.
Well, we expect it, but we're gonna give you a moment and come back, because Coop, you wanted to say something.
I don't know. I just thought it was interesting that Bergson had such an aversion to the cinema, which seems to really, I mean, the way that you describe him, his use of images, etc. And I think even the example of the, dividing up the tortoise and the hare, or Achilles and the hare, into these discrete little packages or what have you, is kind of interesting. How that's literally how the cinema functions, but it produces this kind of flow state, or at least a perceived state of flow, which kind of, I think, maybe is more Bergsonian in a way. So it's just an interesting contradiction there, that he sort of seemingly from the surface you feel like he'd have a lot of I would say maybe appreciation for the way that what the cinema does. And I think in to put language on the front and center there, because you can communicate without words, right? Like just literal images without even language itself. Obviously there's concepts that we use, but it kind of feels like it would go very well with his sort of philosophical position with regard to that. But
yeah, no, that's an interesting way of thinking about it, because he has this. So he said he'd never been to the cinema,
right?
But yet he was very aware of how the machine itself worked, and he uses it. He used the cinematograph, as again another kind of analogy for how our intellect works.
Right.
Where he's saying actually the motion you're seeing on the screen is an illusion of movement. And it's what our intellect tends to do when we think we're talking about time, we think we're talking about movement. What we're usually doing is actually talking about a juxtaposition of immobile states. And that's kind of how the machine itself, the cinematograph machine works, where it's sort of these, the machine deceives us into thinking that movement is being recomposed from immobility. So I think it's interesting what you're saying about how perhaps he missed a trick there with like actually the mobility that the mobility that is conveyed on screen and that can be said without words. Perhaps if he had been to the cinema, he would have been moved in ways. I think he was very interested in the ways, for instance, music could convey things without words as well. He was very into music.
Yeah, that was a great example too. I guess the way that like musical notation versus the performance really drew in that kind of contrast that he was getting at with regard to language and how it can be a sort of hindrance, or it doesn't really, that kind of analytic perspective might not necessarily capture the entire picture, not to be using a pun, but I also think like there's something, obviously we're Deleuze and Guattari nerds, and one of Guattari's big things is like the asignifying, which and affect as well. And I think the cinema is like maybe one of the most, aside from music, I mean, obviously, like Guattari was very big on music being a really great asignifying, like the potency, what is it, the redundancies, I forget. Taylor, you have to.
Well, I was just thinking about their concept of the refrain, right? So,
I suppose that too, yeah.
As a way of warding off chaos and these other things.
But I think the cinema too, obviously, like I was getting at with the way that you can communicate so much without actual spoken dialogue and affect and all of that. I don't know, just seemed, very interesting, kind of dovetailing. Obviously, Deleuze is certainly owes a legacy to Bergson, as Taylor pointed out earlier. But no question there.
We have to get to the cinema books, where Deleuze will try to figure out a way of bringing a Bergsonian lens to the cinema that might move past this contradiction, quote unquote, that you were calling it, Coop. But it does. I think some of the similar quandaries is to go back to creative evolution, and Emily, allow you to keep going with this. I know that one of the things, if intellect I'll use the word faculty. I know it may seem strange, but if intellect is our faculty of analysis and of breaking things up, which is what Bergson sees the cinema doing, right? And intuition is our view from within, as you were describing it, more holistically. I mean, to continue the introduction of metaphysics stuff, Bergson, after giving those examples, right, that you set out of the literary character and the arm movement, he's like, well, the one piece of intuition that we're most familiar with is sort of ourselves, right? The feeling of actually lived embodiment, we might call it. But there's that. What's interesting too is in creative evolution, we have this third element, which he also seemed to get a lot of criticism for, which is instinct. And so maybe I wanted you to, you don't have to immediately talk about instinct, but that would be one of the threads that I found really interesting in Creative Evolution, where he's talking about, say, like life-solving problems and these other things. It's some of the most beautiful prose in Bergson's work for me.
Yeah, I agree that those passages are really beautiful. I think, yeah, that's what I think I got sidetracked myself, because that actually was something I wanted to get at as well. Was that the reason he writes Creative Evolution is also because he wants to figure out how it is that intuition beyond sort of just, introspective knowledge is possible. And so he spends a lot of time in the book, as I've mentioned, sort of situating the intellect within this kind of history, and the relationship with inert matter. And actually, he does a really interesting move, I think, to say, the intelligence or the intellect is always often portrayed as this pure, the faculty of pure knowledge, and he's saying no, it's a tool for making tools. It's an extension of our tool making abilities, our intellect, and that's why it does so well, with the inert. But it's not it's an adaptation. It's one possible way of dealing as an organism with the external world, especially as organisms kind of become more and more and sort of nervous systems become more and more complicated. And so he gets into this, there's sort of these three aspects. So instinct and intelligence are, for him, sort of two solutions that organisms have found over the course of their evolution to deal with the obstacles presented by their environment. And so intellect, it has in humans, it has also evolved this kind of self-awareness factor or self-reflexivity. But there's also instinct, which is an internal knowledge of life without, usually, or actually in most organisms, kind of without the light of self-reflexivity. So there's this, I'm not going to find the quote again, but I've just found it. Really great way of summing it up, where he says there are things that the intellect alone is capable of looking for, but will never find by itself. Instinct alone could find these things, but will never go looking for them. So instinct is sort of tapped in to the internal movement of life, but doesn't have the kind of self-reflexivity, or whatever you want to call it, to even be aware of what it's doing, because it's just doing the movement of life. It's pure sort of action almost. And so what Bergson does he says that, there's no one organism that is pure intellect or pure instinct. Evolution is a movement of divergence. And so we all have, he doesn't talk about it in these terms, but it's basically the idea of common ancestry, which means that even if humans tend more perhaps towards intellectual thinking, it's not to say that there's no instinct left in us, and so that kind of is the condition of possibility of intuition. It's that we still are able to tap into an internal knowledge of life, and that only actually becomes possible through the self-reflexivity of the intellect. So intuition is only possible because of our intelligence. So again, this kind of shows he's not throwing away intelligence. He's not saying we should revert back to being full-on instinctive, beings with no concepts. He's saying actually it's our shared ancestry. It's the fact that we kind of carry these tendencies within us that makes it possible to, again, and he really describes it in terms of sort of catch a fleeting glimpse, turn around, as we are evolution pushing forwards, we can just sort of turn around and catch a quick glance of the movement of evolution through intuition. So I hope that makes sense. But I think it's so much more subtle than the way he's caricatured. I mean, that's kind of what happens with caricature anyway.
It does feel, again, though, I mean, one of the, if we're going to keep dipping back into the Bertrand Russell, since he's the primary enemy, as I know you didn't put that in the book, but you tweeted that out.
He's the villain, yeah.
He's the villain. And as Deleuze says, in every history of philosophy, someone has to play the villain. For Deleuze, it's Hegel. for Bergson. Now, for Bergson, I don't know if he himself had villains. You might know. I don't know if he probably ignored his contemporary enemies, but in any case, in our history, in the one that you bring us, Bertie Russell can be the enemy, and I do think, beyond jealousy, which is, an easy way of characterizing it. I do think it does it.
He's stuck in
this too out of the intellectual milieu.
You got stuck in duration there, bro.
Yeah, I missed.
I see. Yeah, I got stuck in the heterogeneous multiplicity of.
We were.
I apologize. Coop, please, either keep this in or not. I meant to say you yourself paint a portrait against which, let's say, Bergson is gently reacting in its, say, its belief in progress, in how the intellect can solve and promote all these new solutions to problems through technology and etc., which obviously World War I will change that. But even before then, Bergson is pushing back against the dominance or I think that's the interesting thing, where he doesn't shy away from.
Yeah, we keep losing you.
So, all right.
You want to restart your computer?
I can do that. I was only leading up to saying Bergson doesn't shy away from metaphysics as a title. Metaphysics is a dirty word sometimes.
Yeah.
But not for Bergson. And I know Deleuze will follow him up on this. Not that that's important, but sometimes metaphysics gets turned into the bad philosophy, and for Bergson, there's not in promoting intuition, he's also promoting the singularity of philosophy against, say, what science is going to be doing with citizen intellect and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads to him being caricatured by people like Russell in particular as anti-rationalist, anti-science, and also as someone who doesn't understand the science. So all of these things are sort of demonstrably false. So Russell, just for the context of it all, as you said, there was some professional jealousy in there a little bit, namely that Russell's presidential address for the Aristotelian Society in 1911 or 12 has to be moved because Bergson is visiting, and they want Bergson to be able to attend, so they move the whole thing just for this one guy. So Russell did not like that, and it kind of turns into this kind of vendetta type of thing, and he ends up writing a paper called The Philosophy of Bergson, which is then reproduced almost word for word 30 years later in his History of Western Philosophy. And in this paper, he sort of makes fun of Bergson for being someone who thinks, so he portrays him as being someone who doesn't understand mathematics and who thinks that being good at mathematics is a sign of, being a bad philosopher or something, which, again, is not anywhere near close to anything Bergson is saying ever. And then I can't remember if it's in that paper where Russell kind of paints Bergson as saying that instinct, it should be the guiding force of philosophical thought. Again, as I, previously in what I've just been saying just before, that's not what he's saying at all. The idea that Bergson was bad at mathematics is even more ludicrous, that when you know that when he was a teenager, he sort of casually solved this sort of 200-year-old geometry problem that the polymath Pascal had left unsolved, and he just did it. And his teacher, his maths teacher, was sort of dismayed when he found out Bergson was going to study philosophy. And there's also just the fact that every single one of Bergson's major books, it sort of engages so profoundly and so seriously with the science of his day, in matter and memory, sort of neurophysiology in painstaking detail, the neurophysiology of aphasia, in creative evolution. He has read all the evolutionists. He's very well aware and very well tuned into the debates between the different kinds of evolutionism, because it's not just Darwinism in the early 20th century. There's all sorts of competing evolutionary theories. So to say that he's anti-science or that he doesn't understand science is, again, demonstrably false. And the fact that Bergson is critical of certain aspects of scientific thinking in no way means that he thinks we should throw these theories away. So, for instance, in biology, a lot of what he's saying is that concepts have the unfortunate habit of solidifying certain aspects of the reality that they're trying to describe, such that some of the aspects of that reality then appear contradictory. So with an organism, you'll have something like you'll have both tendencies towards individuation. So organisms often want to be individuals, but then at the same time, there's this tendency towards reproduction. And those two things aren't inherently contradictory, but sometimes our frameworks are too restrictive to allow for these seemingly contradictory tendencies to cohabit. And they only become contradictions through our kind of models and frameworks. And so this idea he has is that, he says something like all the frameworks crack, they're too rigid for the reality we're trying to sort of cram into them. And so essentially all he's saying is once the biologist, has done his or her stuff, the philosopher still has a lot to say, and actually a lot will be missed by the biologist. And actually, if we look at all the competing theories of evolution, all of them have tapped into certain important aspects of the biological reality they're describing, but all of them also completely distort or miss out on other aspects. And only the metaphysician, because not constrained by the practical requirements of science, is able to take this kind of I don't want to say unbiased, but perhaps more absolute view of life, in the sense that it's not relative to these concepts or systems.
That is Bergson's word, right? Absolute is associated with intuition.
Yeah, absolute, because not relative to a particular point of view, conceptual point of view. But there's this very strong, he pushes very strongly for this idea that not only should philosophy be a collaborative effort, metaphysics should be something that actually progresses in the same way that science does, but also that science and metaphysics should be destined to push one another forward. So this is very far from this idea of someone who has this kind of medieval view of science as something to be shunned and pushed away, and that only what intuition suggests to us should be it's just so far from the truth. And yet that is what Russell prints in 1912 and again in the 40s when he publishes A History of Western Philosophy. That's still on a lot of shelves, and that was something I found really important to rectify this complete misconception that Bergson himself was kind of despaired, but he just like, where do I ever write this? All these things that people are saying, I'm saying. I get riled up about this.
No,
it is sort of sad to see the way that the humanities are being defunded everywhere and really missing out on this, like, like this kind of dialectical relationship between like these analytical processes and the creative, like metaphysical things that like often, these are, speaking about evolution, right? Like this tension is what kind of really drives, I don't know, progress. I don't want to say progress perhaps, but whatever the process of evolution, right? Like these are two necessary components, and to focus on one side of that only and valorize one side of that process feels very, I don't know, like we're certainly like we're losing something.
Yeah, I really agree. And also especially when it just feels like what is actually happening, whenever there's kind of a push for rationality without metaphysics or whatever, often what happens, it just means that that there's unconscious metaphysics going on. There's just
right.
that it's just that they're not, or unconscious ideology even. Whenever tech guys or whatever want to do away with the humanities, all that happens is that they are unconsciously reproducing theory or whatever, but in the worst way possible. And so it is such a shame. And the way in which humanity degrees are deemed not useful for society. It's just this idea that you have to be productive to be of value. And it's just, I mean, that's just outrageous to me, but that seems to be something that people subscribe to. Yeah.
I mean, this is a banal example, but I would even think the first thing that comes to mind is something like Star Trek with some of the technology. Like, obviously, this is a fantasy that is, obviously the fantasy it gets its influence from the existing technological milieu, but then comes up with these ideas that, again, the ideas that are pressed there become a reality in terms of the technology, or inspire people to recreate that technology and what have you, that I think is really kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
Sort of lose something to privilege one over the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, are you?
Yeah, I'm back.
Did you beat the hare this time? Or are you still?
Did I beat I may be still caught in virtual limbo.
Have you started?
Yeah, I did restart, and we'll just have to figure something out in the future. I'm sorry about this.
No worries.
Yeah, I think planned obsolescence is our enemy.
Yeah.
I guess I know we were talking about Birdie for a minute. We hit him. I guess I think the one concept which you've discussed already, I guess we don't necessarily need to bring it back up, is Dure, which when I translated Chernyavsky's book, and he puts so much emphasis on Bergson's influence on Deleuze, I decided to follow Landis, the new creative evolution translation, and keep that word untranslated. Because our English word duration generally implies the opposite of what Bergson's talking about. Duration implies something that we can cut up and measure, and as you've already laid out, it's heterogeneous qualitative multiplicity that cannot be metrically subdivided. So I just wanted to say that also goes to your point that you started off with about language and how sometimes that can get in the way. And while maybe even Dure isn't perfect, it's better than duration. I think maybe just the fact that it's slightly awkward for the Anglophone, that they'll keep in mind that we don't mean duration. And I put it in my translator's forward. I'm not trying to plug my book. I'm trying to say like that. I think that the English translation of Dure is, I agree with Landis that it's not helpful and implies the opposite.
Yeah, it completely implies, a length of time, something extremely spatial and measurable, which Dure does not. And the same with the élan vital, which is a very controversial notion, but that is translated often as vital impetus, which again is actually that only captures one aspect of what Bergson is trying to do. And I think Landis also he uses élan vital in his translation of creative evolution. Because
was that not standard? Did the original translation render it as vital impetus? And I forgot this.
Yeah, the 1911 translation uses vital impetus, which
that's gross.
Yeah, which really does. I mean, it's not surprising that then Bergson is taken to be this vitalist in the most primitive sense of the term, I guess, because vital impetus really gives you the sense that it's this force, this mystical force, when again he says it quite explicitly, it's an image. And in French, élan, it really gives you a sense of it, sort of various images taken from the physical world. So the idea of gathering momentum. You can, in a more figurative sense, you can breathe new elan into a dwindling project. In a psychological sense, it's like a uncontrollable surge and spontaneous surge of emotion, and all of these are captured in that image, which is completely lost, I think, in the English translation. So that's interesting, and I agree with you. I think Duré is not perfect, but no words are ever going to capture.
I mean, it's Bergson's word. It's because it's not translated. It kind of stands out and forces one to recall heterogeneity and not this homogeneity that which sets up the. I love this anecdote where I guess is it chapter 4. It's very early in the book where Bergson you sort of paint a nice picture of Bergson being asked after a lecture, I suppose, about distilling his philosophy, and he says, "What, time is not space, madam," or frankly, I don't give a damn. Frankly, like it's something very like off the cuff. I love it.
Yeah, well, it's this idea that how could I distill my philosophy into one sentence? I simply argue that time is not space, and to be fair, that is pretty spot on. The idea that the letter T in the equations of mechanics contains no temporality at all, and for time to be measured, it has to be frozen, and therefore we just lose whatever there is qualitative there as well.
No, it's I guess it's nice because this goes back all the way back, Coop, when we were talking about your favorite episodes, because one of the things that Bergsonism begins with is that why Bergson is so important is he wants to distinguish true, actual like problems from false problems, from these sort of made up problems. And the first thing that Deleuze lays out almost like axiomatically following Bergson is that decide or differentiate true problems from false problems based on time, not on space. And so one of the examples he gives is, I think it's in the same collection as Introduction to Metaphysics, which is, it's not mind energy, it's the creative mind, I believe. And it's on, I think it's just called the possible and the real or something like this.
Yeah, in French it is le possible et le réel. So I can't remember what the English translation is, but yes.
But yeah, so it's very interesting that it's although this is not a good example of time and space, but I love this image of nothingness being actually more than being, right? I mean, speaking in metaphysical terms, nothing is more to being. It's being plus this logical operation of negation. But I think that the more and the less, Deleuze works out later it's similar to this time and space thing, because it's when we're thinking spatially, when we break up being into, this infinitesimal amount of parts, and then we try to reconstruct it or subtract it and then look at the absence. But he's still saying that's a spatializing type of analytic, intellectual type of view, not the intuitive movement of the whole.
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring this up, actually, because I think that is something that's really cool about the moves that Bergson makes in a lot of his books, which he tends to often he will take two seemingly antagonistic, opposed schools of thought, so realism and idealism or whatever, or like a mechanism and what he calls finalism.
Finalism,
and then he shows actually these are two sides of the same coin, and he does that move over and over again, and quite convincingly often, as well. He does that in Time and Free Will as well, with sort of determinism and then a version of free will that he disagrees with, and all of that to say that the point he's making really often is that, as you were saying just then, to spatially think and to conceptually think sometimes generates these sort of artificial oppositions that actually, generate false problems, as you said. And I just think he has such a, actually, he's often described as this sort of poetic, I don't know, that his writing is ambiguous or whatever. Actually, I think he's extremely clear and very rigorous. And I think that's one of the places where that's the most evident, is the way he just kind of breaks down, okay, well, side A and side B of the same coin. And I always think that's really cool.
Well, I guess the realism and idealism is, you see that in Matter and Memory.
Yeah.
He wants to hold the image sort of equidistant from these two and find a way through without trying to side on either one. So, that's just an example I'm thinking of. And it's extremely important. I guess I did want to give you a chance. We've talked about Russell and a little bit about his popularity, and we talked about creative evolution. Do you want to say a few words about this surge in popularity that he had since, we've talked about his waxing and waning of influence and popularity? You begin the book in your first chapter with a hilarious anecdote with this poor
Le Roi Beaulieu, he's called.
Yeah, Beaulieu. Yeah. Okay. So, you sort of begin with hinting at his extreme popularity. I guess maybe that's something that is, I mean, I guess there was a recent article too in the past year or two about, like, the first quote unquote traffic jam in New York. I don't know. I guess we could talk a little bit more about the man and the legend.
Yeah. So it's really interesting to see how he's kind of hit with fame in a way that very rarely happens to philosophers. Because he basically, he was an extremely gifted student, and he kind of rose the ranks of French academia, and he did it very diligently, and he did his best to be at the best possible place in his career. And he did that very well all throughout sort of from the 1880s to around 1900. He managed to get, the right jobs, and he ended up at the Collège de France, which is a slightly weird institution. I don't know if there are many equivalents where it's
you should say something about that. You should.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think people know.
Yeah, so it's still to this day, and for many centuries now, the Collège de France is this. So it's very close to the Sorbonne in Paris. It's a beautiful building, and it you have all these quite famous academics who, if you're given a chair at the Collège de France, you do weekly lectures, but there's no enrollment process for students. It's all public lectures, and it was originally founded as in opposition to the kind of scholastic, sclerotic, scholasticism of the Sorbonne, and it was meant to promote humanist ideals, really, of and sort of democratizing knowledge. And so that definitely explains in part how Bergson became so famous. But obviously it isn't enough, because there were lots of lecturers at the Collège de France that didn't become international celebrities. But so Bergson starts lecturing there in 1900. And at this point, he's already published 2 of his major books, Time and Free Will and Matter and Memory. He's very well regarded, or at least, quite well known within academic circles in France and abroad a little bit as well. William James is starting to read him. And but it's around 1905, and then especially with the publication of Creative Evolution in 1907, that all of a sudden, his lectures just start. There's just too many people coming to see his lectures. There's not enough room. And so the anecdote I mentioned at the beginning of the book is that the poor guy lecturing before the time slot before Bergson, suddenly his lecture theatre was full, and it was full of people who were there to save a seat for Bergson's lecture, and sometimes they would send in their valet. So he'd have this rowdy crowd of people who were not listening to him because they were just there to make sure they got in. So that was extremely embarrassing for Bergson, not very good for his relationship with his colleagues. And it got out of hand quite quickly. It was to the point that, people were fainting in the lecture theatre. And as you said, when he traveled to New York in 1913, he gave a lecture at Columbia University, which caused a traffic jam on Broadway, allegedly. But I've found various testimonials about
it. Might be apocryphal or
I mean, I found mention of it in newspapers, and I found mention of sort of the so I can't remember if this was in New York or if it was at Harvard maybe, but there was a tea organized by the wives, I think.
Yeah, you mentioned that. Yeah,
and 1,000 people showed up. So it was a level of fame that he definitely, even though he had pursued he wanted to shine in his academic career, he never pursued fame, and fame kind of found him in a way that was just so sudden and huge, and it was just all of a sudden he was just mentioned everywhere. In every single book being published around 1910, you would find a reference to him, from political pamphlets to biological treaties to the manifestos of the futurist movement, or feminist manifestos, or Catholic modernists, or revolutionary syndicalists, all of these thinkers that didn't have a lot to do with him. Actually, he's more of a, politically speaking, I would say, more of a middle of the road, what we would call a centrist, probably. Not radical in any way. And yet all these quite radical thinkers were claiming their allegiance to his thinking, crowding up his lectures, and then he attracted a lot of anger and antagonism as well. So we've mentioned Russell, but there was also kind of the
Benda, right?
So yes, Benda. Yes, he was one. And before Benda, there was so Benda on the left, but then on the far right there was Charles Maurras.
Oh, the anti-Semites, right?
Yeah. So who were sort of Catholic extremists is the only way I can really sort of royalist Catholics, anti-Semites, who accused Bergson of being a kind of anti-rationalist. France was the country of Cartesian rationalism, and Bergson, with his feminine intuitionist philosophy, was destroying the sort of masculine rationality of Descartes. So that all these horrible attacks. And in the middle of all that, Bergson, who is this actually quite timid, quiet man, is absolutely hating it. He can't. He just finds it really hard to deal with, which I just find so fascinating in terms of, as a biographer, to see this tension between a man who so clearly wants to shine in his career, and at the same time, there's a part of him that just really wants to be in a secluded area of France and just thinking about philosophy with no one bothering him. And there's just this constant pull between the two sides.
Can I jump over two things real quick? One was what was interesting, because we do see him being associated as, derogatorily as being feminine in not just because of the attendees, a lot of whom were women, but because of these far-right extremists who, as you mentioned. But I thought it was interesting that detailing his time at primary school, and maybe did he attend the Sorbonne?
École Normale Supérieure, which
he went to the that's right. Sorry.
Which is another weird French institution.
Right.
It's quite hard to explain, but
I can't remember if it was the primary school or if it was at the École where
a bit later, that he was nicknamed Miss.
That's what I was. You knew what I was going to say. I thought that was interesting. That already in his youth he is being, but you sort of characterize this as not necessarily merely a kind of bullying or derogatory term. That there is some affection attached to it. I'm trying to recall how you put it.
The sense I got. So the sense I got was that it was boarding school boys, basically. So the École Normale Supérieure is a higher education institution, but they all live together in the
Right.
place. So it's got a bit of a boarding school vibe. So there was definitely something misogynistic or whatever you want to qualify it as, sort of a jeer, in response to his perceived delicateness, I guess, as a person. But the sense I get is that he was also quite respected, and that he was quite admired. He was one of the best students of the school in a place where intellectual ability was revered. So he and Jaurès were kind of the two stars of their class. And so despite being, and it seems like even his friends would call him Miss, and that he would be okay with that in their correspondence. And even years and years later, when there was someone, so I can't remember if it was when he was being given the Legion of Honor, which is I guess the equivalent, the secular version of a knighthood, I guess, in France. One of the person who was giving a speech about him, I think, referred back to that nickname, or was going to anyway, or something. So there's a sense in which it was perhaps a bit mean-spirited, but also that's just how these boys were with each other.
Okay. Yeah.
But it is interesting. I agree that he was perceived as feminine. It might also have been a reference to his mother, who was British. So it's an English.
So he wasn't called Mademoiselle, or Mademoiselle, or he was called Ms. Okay.
Yes, okay. Which so it's not as straightforward as it just being straight up bullying. But I don't know how he felt about it. But it's interesting that then that continued later, where it was said, well, if women enjoy his philosophy so much, and there were, as you said, many women attending his lectures, then it can't be very good philosophy. That was one of the things that started coming up in the press. It's like, so there were misogynistic attacks sort of against him. He's a bad philosopher because women enjoy his philosophy. There was also attacks against the women themselves, where it's like, well, they're women, so they clearly don't understand the philosophy, so they're just going there because it's the fashionable thing to do, and they were given all
seen.
Exactly. It's the fashionable thing. They're worldly, mondaine women. They were given all sorts of derogatory nicknames in the press. And then a really interesting little thing I found in a French newspaper was that when they were having debates about whether to give women the vote in French Parliament, and that women were given the vote quite late in France. And one of the lawmakers uses the fact that women seem to enjoy Bergson as a reason to not give them the vote, because he says, well, intuition, while it may be a very interesting tool of philosophy, it should not be a tool of civic decision making. So these intuitive women should not be given the vote. So it kind of is just used. It's used against Bergson. It's used against the women in all sorts of ways. And then the anti-Semitism and the misogyny tied together. And so Bergson is this effeminate, feminine barbarian, they call him, because Jewish.
Yeah.
And feminine traits of not being very rational in the minds of these misogynists became opposed to, as I said, Cartesian rationalism, masculine values. So it's I mean, that must have been quite horrendous to be on the receiving end of all that. And he didn't really speak out about any of it. He kind of kept quiet, I think, probably hoping to not attract more attention to himself.
And even seemed to want to discourage his colleagues, like Peggy, right, from lashing out for him or something.
Yes. Yeah.
So he extended the silence to those who might defend him, or wanted to extend that silence.
Yeah. It seems that he really did not like confrontation.
Yeah.
And that he was very afraid of, I think, probably, France, late 19th, early 20th century France is an extremely hostile environment for anyone who's Jewish.
Yeah.
The Dreyfus affair, which I don't know if people are familiar, it's kind of this big debate that at its heart was about a horrible miscarriage of justice, where a Jewish officer was falsely accused of treason, and it kind of divides the country for decades, and all the anti-Semitic rhetoric is daily kind of in the newspapers. So I think he was just terrified of how that could affect his career, probably, and he didn't want to, I think, rock the boat in any way, and he didn't want to encourage further attacks.
But also, it seems like you were saying maybe he kept quiet about this affair too because he didn't want to further divide France. Which goes to his kind of about face during World War One, where he becomes, let's say, nationalist, and where he takes up some of the I mean, that's some of the most fascinating stuff in the book, where he goes and even meets with President Wilson and is trying to get America involved in the war, and is on these secret missions to Spain and these other this other way of but you also characterize it, and this is perhaps, I think, honest and fair. You say that he becomes a part of the propaganda machine for France in the war, and he's trying to. This just goes to show that part of keeping silent during the Dreyfus affair, I think you say in passing that part of this is a kind of feeling of wanting to keep from further dividing France, and it being in the interests of the French people and nation. But
no, you're, and that's something I didn't mention when I was kind of talking about his upcoming. I think he had this reverence for French institutions, and that might come from the fact that he was kind of raised by these institutions, because from age 10 he was alone in he got all these scholarships to study in quite prestigious French secondary schools, while his family, who were not wealthy, his father was kind of a struggling composer, they moved to London to further the father's career, and so Bergson was left alone from age 10, basically. Grew up on his own in a boarding house, but that was covered by his scholarships. And I think he just had this sense that everything good that had happened to him in his life came from going through this, the academic, sort of climbing the academic ladder in France. And so he has this real patriotism. And he says in private about the Dreyfus affair, he says, yes, it was a miscarriage of justice, but it is what really saddens me is the impact it's having on our institutions and the damage it's doing to our country. So that's an interesting take on a really horrible episode of French history. And as you said, during World War One, he is, when World War One breaks out, he's president of the Academy of Moral and Political Sciences.
Right.
One of the there are these big sort of learned societies, very prestigious institutions. And as president of the Moral and Political Science Academy, he delivers a series of speeches that are absolutely nationalistic in tone, where he does something that up until then he'd always refused to do, which is kind of apply his philosophy to politics. And so he speaks about sort of France and its allies in terms of élan vital, and he speaks of Germany in terms of barbarism and mechanism. And so it's a very emotional reaction that he kind of distances himself from much later. But it's this reaction where they're getting news about sort of war crimes that are happening in Belgium, and all of these, and just this idea of German imperialism, I guess. And it's this very heated emotional response that definitely can be one explanation, again, for why he falls out of favor later, because any goodwill he had from left-wing thinkers after that was kind of gone, because it was quite violent rhetoric, really, what he was using. But again, I think you can temper it and explain it by contextualizing it as heat of the moment almost, and also speaking as a representative of this. Again, he's speaking in the name of this institution that he values so highly. And then later, yes, he is sent by the French government to the US to sway Wilson, which is incredible. It's an incredible aspect of the story. which people are often surprised about his his role in that side of diplomacy and propaganda.
Well, as you mentioned, one thing, I mean, Wilson, president of, was it Princeton University?
Yeah.
Like, so he gets to the colleagues in the academic world, he can kind of pull on that thread. And, you mentioned, I forget his name, the lovingly called the colonel, though not in the army. He's able to meet with Wilson's advisors and have influence there. But the other thing too that's interesting and that I didn't think about was I'm not sure if it's the conflict with Prussia when Bergson is 10, 11, 12. So right after, as you said, he is at the boarding schools and
left alone, basically.
And left alone, there is this conflict which already, and obviously France and Germany probably already had tensions going back hundreds of years, right? But it reignites that conflict, and there's so even at the early age in France, there is discord that is associated, right, with being in France, and some of that enmity, if you will, against Germany it still seems like it's held over 40 years later or so.
Absolutely. And so talking about because yes, anti-Germanic sentiment in France, definitely, especially because they lost against Prussia, so there's this kind of humiliating defeat thing that then is flipped in World War I. But despite all of that, and despite the nationalistic tone of his speeches, he, contrary to some of his colleagues, was always firmly against kind of punishing or shunning any of the German colleagues he may have had. So he was still very much for intellectual collaboration with German scholars, and which is interesting. I think that says a lot as well about his position. It is hard to place oneself back into a time when countries like France and Germany are in such a tense relationship.
And you pointed out, it extended to his philosophy, that during the war, I'm not sure if it was a pamphlet or a sort of overview of the history of philosophy where France is patriotically put to the forefront, but before and after the war, this let's say nationalism in the history of philosophy recedes or is not present from this timeline, and it becomes again a kind of no one country can claim to be can claim the mantle of philosophy's greatest. So absolutely. I thought that was an interest, that it wasn't just a war effort on a political front, that it did even extend to his philosophical claims.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as you said, I think it was, it's escaping me now, but I believe it was for one of those World Fair events, and it might have been in Chicago or something. He wrote something to be sent there, and it was kind of like history of philosophy, France. We did so much, and it was part of a propaganda effort as well to kind of paint France as, I guess, more civilized. But then he, after and before, as you said, that's not at all the kind of rhetoric he's using. So there's Bergson the philosopher, and then there's Bergson the kind of diplomat, vehicle of French propaganda, or at least a vehicle of French interests during a very volatile time. With Wilson, I think it was a genius move from the French government, because they suspected that sending a diplomat might be seen as too aggressive, whereas sending a world famous, revered philosopher, Wilson would be perhaps flattered slightly by that. And Bergson played a very clever game, as you said, of kind of befriending all the right people and getting in closer and closer to the president's inner circle, until he actually did meet with Wilson. and probably had an impact. I would think. I'd like to think, because a lot of the arguments he was using had to do with if the US want to have a seat at the United Nations table, the League of Nations.
League of Nations, yeah.
Then they would have to be part of the war. Otherwise, they would be then left out of those negotiations afterwards.
I think that alone would have been a really important point to make to Wilson, who was very much trying to get this body established. And I suppose, I know that we're coming close to 2 hours, so I do want to wind down. We value your time, and but I do want to allow this space. The reason why we were talking about World War I is the aftermath includes some of the factors of why Bergson's star begins to fade. It does feel like part of it is that after the First World War, that which was in fashion before the war is already called into question. But you even throw in that a lot of Bergson's patriotic political propagandist efforts too seem to backfire on him, particularly for example, those on the left. And so I guess I wanted to leave you a little bit of space, since we can't cover everything, but at least we could talk about the waning of his stardom, and that also being one of the reasons why there wasn't an English biography already out before the work you've done.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, that I think there was a sense in which the moment when Bergson was so famous, he just arrived at the right time. No pun intended. Like he really captured something that was already going on. People feeling wariness about quantification seeping into all areas of life, and his notions of creativity and freedom really struck a chord with all sorts of, as you say, sort of left-leaning political movements. Not only left-leaning, it kind of covered the whole spectrum. But after the war, not only I truly believe that the cataclysm of the war, that the war represented, of, a whole generation almost lost, literally, and then those who survived it, what counted as hope or what counted as ideals had just completely shifted. The world before the war was gone. So there's the fact that there's a big ideological, or I don't know if ideological is the name, but there's just a big shift. There's also, as you also mentioned, that once the war is over, anyone who would have been left-leaning and interested in Bergson no longer was, but partly because of the nationalistic tone of his speeches. There's also the fact that he stops lecturing.
That's right.
So in 1914, he takes leave from the Collège de France, I think intending to return, but then he has all these diplomatic missions. And then in the early 1920s, he's actually involved in this advisory board for the early League of Nations, called the committee, something like the International Committee for Intellectual Cooperation. And he was sort of president of that for a while, and it involved all sorts of so much work that he was just removed from his public life at that point. Another thing that happens, and I won't get into too much detail, just mentioning passing, that he has this unfortunate, he's sort of dragged into this public debate with Einstein that just goes very badly for him, even though it's another one of those cases of him being read uncharitably, I would say. So more about that in the book. And also there's a whole book about that incident alone that's by Jimena Canales, which is really good if that aspect interests you. And I do mention it also in the book. But that kind of cements, in a way, this idea of him misunderstanding the science of his day. In certain people's minds anyway.
Further confirmation of what people have said, that he doesn't understand science and math and physics, and
which is I'd like to underline, really unfair.
Yeah.
Because he was able to engage with relativity, I think, he did misinterpret, or perhaps he missed a few points, but imagine what it was like to engage with the theory of relativity in the 1920s. There were very few people who were able to do it on a serious level.
I think the misunderstanding is more heavily on Einstein, but that's a whole other.
Einstein certainly didn't engage seriously with Bergson as seriously as Bergson did with Einstein's work, and it led to them completely sort of missing each other in a way. So all of that doesn't help, and then he's extremely ill from around the mid-20s, and he just has horrendous sort of rheumatoid arthritis. That means that he is absolutely removed from public life, and that people just assume that he's dead at that point. And when his final book, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, comes out, there was no press release that, it just suddenly appeared, and some people were surprised that he was still alive. So all of these things, so the meteoric rise to fame, I think there are a lot of environmental factors there to do with the mood at the time, and then the massive mood shift of the war, and all these other factors I've mentioned. And then, after his death, that's when Russell's bestseller is published, further cementing all the misconceptions. And you mentioned Deleuze a few times, and it's just that in France, the existentialists take over for a while, and they're not very sympathetic to Bergson, because he's the guy they need to take down to kind of, he's kind of the classic at this point. And it's only, I think, with Deleuze that France is reacquainted with Bergson.
Yay, Deleuze.
But in the English-speaking world, it has taken a lot longer, and there have been some really good so the Canales book I mentioned is great. That in around the same, no, maybe slightly later, Mark Sinclair published a Routledge sort of Bergson textbook.
Okay.
And it's kind of covers his whole philosophy in a textbook way, in a way that you would want if you're a student and you want to get acquainted. But it's also beautifully written. It's a really good book. So there've been all
Pearson, Majorca. Sorry? Keith Ansel Pearson, Majorca. You mentioned you have a whole list of sort of his resurgence in English as well.
Yeah, so I have a beginner's guide to Bergson at the end of the book. So sort of further reading, and also all of his works that have been translated. Yeah. But all that to say that I think in the Anglophone world, certainly in the university world, there has been renewed interest. And so I really hope that I'm just contributing to broadening that interest outside of the universities. And in the universities, but
yeah, I think so. That's the thing. It is for if you've never heard of Bergson, you can pick it up and get a lot out of it. If you already know his philosophy, you're going to be stunned by a lot of the historical background and those details, and that'll put in a new light some of the development of his concepts. So I think it is for the expert and the beginner alike, which is always difficult, tightrope to walk. And I guess any final thoughts? Anything? Well, we always give the outro. The outro would be to give you a forum for talking about any other projects you are working on or that are forthcoming. So this is your stage to sort of talk about.
Yeah, we just lost you a little bit, but I think I can take it from here, hopefully. There is actually currently, I am sort of basking in the present of having published a book, my first book, and I'm trying to enjoy that as much as I possibly can.
Of course.
And I am actively thinking about future projects and future books, and it might be that I become the person who writes biographies of obscure French philosophers. That would be a great place to be, I think, but we'll see. I'm not quite sure. One reflection maybe I can end on is the way in which it kind of struck me that when I was researching the book, that a lot of the anxieties of the people of Bergson's time, and the reason they were so drawn to him, strongly resonate, I think, with current anxieties. So at the time, kind of the worries about quantification and the ways in which quantification in psychology, for instance, is kind of dehumanizing, or at least taking away from the way we think about consciousness and freedom, and all that kind of worry about the mechanization of the world. I kind of see a real parallel with anxieties, and valid anxieties, about kind of algorithms that are used to put us into categories and boxes, and in a quite dehumanizing way, that's then used for capitalistic and political gain. And then also the whole AI thing.
The weaponization of AI, which we saw come up this week when it was pointed out very broadly that was a program used to sort of automate denials for United Healthcare.
Exactly.
That's just one example.
It's just one example of the way that just the fact that it's even called artificial intelligence, and that with the generative AI stuff as well, that there's claims that it's kind of creative, and then critics have rightly pointed out there's nothing creative about sort of mashing up pre-existing human artworks and then producing slop. But so I think those current anxieties are very similar in tone to early 20th century anxieties, and maybe that's why it's good to return to Bergson. That's my pitch of like why we should read Bergson again.
If you were to write another biography, do you have another philosopher up your sleeve that you really want to investigate?
Weirdly enough, so this isn't my area at all, because I've mainly been 19th, 20th century, but reading about Bergson and when he was in Clermont-Ferrand, and Pascal, even though he's not very obscure, or maybe he is, I don't know. I just find him so fascinating, but I'd have to really brush up on my history, 17th century history, to be able to pull that off. And also mathematics, I guess that'd be quite difficult for me, but
is there a biography of Pascal in English? That's the question.
I'm not sure. I need to check out the competition.
That's right. You have to scope the landscape. Plus, that's a way of you have to talk to the publisher about the market, right?
Exactly.
All that. Yes. So, but that would be interesting. And I mean, Pascal is both. Everybody seems to know his name, but how many people have read the Pensée, right? Like, so exactly. It's I can see that.
Yeah. But I'm not married to that idea. It could be something completely different.
As you said, you're still basking in the glory of the publication, so you can take a sabbatical on that and sit on it, and we can see where that goes. So
yeah, I've really enjoyed this chat, though. Thank you so much for having me.
I apologize for my technical difficulties, but Emily, thank you so much for spending your Sunday afternoon with us. Yeah. And we're gonna let you log off now, and we're gonna just debrief about our next episode. But we will be in touch.
Yeah.
And it will be out probably sometime in the new year, January, February.
Great.
We have a backlog, so we will, but we will be letting you know as soon as that episode drops.
Great. Well, I really enjoyed myself, and it was a really fun conversation. So thanks a lot, and I look forward to hearing. I won't listen to the whole thing because it's the whole listening to your own voice thing. But
you can have other people listen to it. You can.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
But they're really, really great. Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
And once again, thanks to Dr. Emily Herring for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. We'll see y'all next week.
The very rules of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is outcast, the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.